Welcome, everyone. I see attendees beginning to trickle in. We have a fascinating presentation for you today. I'm Laurin Buchanan. I'm with David Tobey, and today we're going to talk about benchmarking the capability maturity of cybersecurity practitioners, educators, and students. We are hoping to make this a very interactive session. We are going to be using polls, and we encourage you to put any questions or comments you may have in the Q&A box, and we will try and answer them as we go through, as well as hopefully at the end, we will have some additional time for more discussions. So with that, I would like to get started with the first poll. Next slide, please. You'll have about 30 seconds to respond when the poll comes up. Just a quick gut reaction of, does more years of experience result in more expert performance? Please go ahead and vote. A few more seconds. Please vote and give us your opinion on, do more years of experience result in more expert performance? Do we have results on the poll? Oh, 50-50. Very interesting. All right, so that's the first poll. There are going to be 5 total. And at this point, I'm going to hand the reins over to David. And if we could have the next slide, please.
Thanks, Laurin. And again, welcome everyone. This project that we're going to talk to you about has been ongoing for many years. It really started back about 10 years ago, really right around when the NICE framework was first coming together. There was a national team of researchers that were assembled to develop and test a set of methods for designing predictive and diagnostic instruments. Most of the tools that we have available to us today to understand talent and development are driven around very summative assessments that are able to look backwards but not forwards, and typically are enabling us to understand sort of the description of someone's capability, but not the prediction of where that capability might move into the future. And so our interest was really in looking at the progression of expertise along a capability maturity curve. And so the first capability maturity model that was developed in cybersecurity, for those who are familiar with it, was called the ESC2M2 for the electric sector's cybersecurity capability maturity model, was the first really to incorporate human factors as part of this concept of a capability maturity, which of course was really begun in the software development arena by Carnegie Mellon when they introduced the concepts of capability maturity modeling to understand software quality development. And we wanted to apply those same techniques and principles to understand cybersecurity readiness and resilience. And so we really were looking to shift the mission and the mindset from really the historical focus with certifications and other techniques for determining qualifications, determining when somebody had met the bar, to instead focus on how do we raise the capability of everyone, all IT workers and all those interested and all those having, all those being a stakeholder to the cybersecurity domain. How do we raise the overall capability? So we developed these techniques that we'll talk about today. The bar that we're after is something called a behaviorally anchored rating. So these are not knowledge tests. These are tests of skilled performance and knowing when and where and how often to implement varying steps or varying tasks in order to ensure that there is a secure state that is developed. Some of the articles, by the way, that talk about this have been published over the years in a new journal called the Cybersecurity Skills Journal that is produced by the National Cyberwatch Center, which I am Director of Research and Assessments. And so I'll post in a little while the link to that website. So if you'd like to get more information either about the history, what was published in the first issue, or some very hot off the press, introduced literally today, the latest issue that looks at the NICE framework specifically and how that framework could be adopted, adapted, and extended. Next slide, please. So the method that we have been using is really designed to help us address these questions of cybersecurity maturity. And it begins by looking at maturity as a process, not an event. So what we're really seeking is to understand someone's progression across the steps of maturity. And therefore, we've conducted a longitudinal study over the last 3 years specifically. That's the data we'll be reporting today. And it's looking at how we might be able to not only identify that state, but get some insight into how best to begin to accelerate that development and to broaden that development. There were 14 areas of responsibility that we examined. Those came from work that was started back in 2010 with the National Board of Information Security Examiners that set up an international standards initiative to begin to understand what were the predictors of job performance in cybersecurity. And we've applied those to better assess talent in education, in certification, and job experience to really understand what really most people think of as typically as the 3 factors that affect the talent pipeline. How are they educated? Are they certified to be able to perform? And what type of experience have they had? And of course, we asked you that first poll question about experience. And perhaps as you'll see from the data, not surprisingly, we need to be a little, questioning what is the role of experience? Is it predictive really of someone's capability or is it not? So collectively, we refer to knowledge, skill, and ability as capabilities. And I think that definition is an important one to keep in mind as we talk through today, that when we speak of capabilities, we're really thinking of a constellation of a profile of individual elements that add up to an ultimate capability. And again, there's an article about specifically what are those definitional differences in the cybersecurity skills journal. Hey, next slide, please.
So we have another poll here. Again, we're going to ask you for a very quick response, no more than 30 seconds on the poll. So what do you think? Does breadth of experience result in more expert performance? If you're doing and have experience in different areas of cybersecurity, does that result in more expert performance? And as always, if you have any questions, comments, please go ahead and use the Q&A function. We're trying to make this as interactive as possible. So let us close that poll and see the results. Okay, almost 50% again. Here we go. So let's close the poll and go on to the next slide.
All right, so what do we mean by breadth of experience? So what you see here at the bottom of this slide is the progression that we would expect someone to go through as they go from first entering interest in a field to becoming a true master of the field. And so they would become a beginner as they're learning the material. Once they've gained understanding, they would be considered proficient. But proficient doesn't mean competent. Proficient is the first step to competence. I need to understand what to do, but then I'll need a lot of practice under varying conditions in order to become competent in performing that job. And then finally, mastery of a field is really driven by, can I respond to unfamiliar, unknown events by adapting and these skills and knowledge to meet the current situation. So that progression we show here really as a line, but the reality is it's much more nonlinear. It's much more of a curve that someone moves up, and we call that the learning curve. And our objective when we first began this study, again going back as far as 10 years, was to understand, could we begin to shorten that curve? Could we begin to accelerate or squeeze that curve so people could move up it quicker? But it began with simply, well, where are they? How do we know? Is somebody at the novice stage, at the beginner stage, at the proficient stage, etc.? So capability maturity assessment is a new type of assessment. It is, again, different from the traditional certification. It complements, as you'll see here today with some of the data we've been able to gather, what we can learn from certifications. It's diagnostic. In that sense, it can determine not only where somebody is, but what is going to be the most effective intervention for them, whether that be additional training or practice, in order for them to more quickly accelerate, that progression from proficient to competent to master. So it builds upon, though, lots of work that's been done over the years. If you go back a number of years in the sciences, they developed the first rudiments of this in something called concept inventories. And these were used initially in physics education and have since been used by many, many other fields. And we've had our first cybersecurity capability assessments that take in this concept inventory form that have just been released in the last few years. Concept inventories are very valid predictors of knowledge, but they don't address that next step. How do I move from proficient to competent? To do that, this process that we're reporting on here today was developing what we call an action inventory. So in addition to understanding someone's ability to understand the concepts of the field, the techniques in the field, how well can they apply them? And specifically, how confident and accurate are they in determining when a particular action needs to take place? And that's what a capability maturity assessment does. So it is specifically asking them for information that can enable us to both understand where they are today and predict where they are likely to progress to tomorrow based on their confidence and their accuracy in determining what are the steps for performance in that particular task domain. Now, these are also standardized assessments. And so what that means is standardization equals scale. Think of things like, if you're familiar with ASVAB in the military, or the SAT, the GRE in education, where those assessments allow us to compare individuals from a wide variety of backgrounds on a standardized scale, so we have a feel for where they sit in relation to others. That in relation to others is reported as percentiles. So the scores that we're going to show you here today are not like raw scores that you would get scoring 8 out of 10 on a test. Instead, they're how do you relatively rank against all of the others in the field that are within the group that is being used for your percentile ranking as a comparison benchmark to determine really where are you in relation to the others. So it allows for comparison. And because it's standardized, those comparisons can be done at an individual level, they can be done at a team level, they can be done at a department level, an organizational level, or even across an entire industry to get a true assessment of what is the state of cybersecurity capability. Okay, the typical assessment takes about 30 to 60 minutes, depending on the functional role or roles that are being assessed. So in a nutshell, that's really what we speak of, the cybersecurity capability maturity assessment. That's what we're talking about. Most important of all, that master, the person that's at the tip of this progression, is the equivalent of someone in the NSA teams. And they are equivalent of that because the lead of the NSA teams is actually who led the initiative for the National Board of Information Security Examiners to establish the job performance models that underlie the cybersecurity capability maturity assessment. Next slide, please.
So we have our next poll. Which is a better indicator of overall cybersecurity capability? Is it certifications or a degree? Which degree? Again, you've got about 30 seconds. Quick response.
And while we're waiting, we had a really interesting chat comment, Laurin, which
Yes.
is a classic statement. I heard many years ago that some people with 20 years of experience have had 1 year of experience 20 times over. And yes, indeed, there is a difference between those who have just been around doing the same thing repeatedly for 20 years versus those who have progressed over those 20 years. And again, that's what that maturity assessment is really designed to look into.
So let's take a look at our poll answers now. Certifications are the clear favorite. No one shows an associate's degree. BA, master's, about equal. All right, let's close and move on to the next slide, please.
Okay, as I mentioned, the National Board of Information Security Examiners looked at job performance. And one of the primary outcomes of that work, which took a series of years to develop, was that there's a need for different types of skills, that those skills array across 14 major areas that are of responsibility that someone might have or a group of people might have in cybersecurity. So what you see here listed are the 14 areas that are categorized by risk-related, management-related, technical-related. One of the interesting findings of that work was that there's a roughly equal, a little bit more heavy emphasis on the value of hard skills, technical skills, but that represented about 56% of overall security performance and security capability. And the other 44% were what most people refer to as soft skills. The reality is there's not really a lot soft about them. They're just as hard to develop. Some would argue harder to develop than some of the harder skills, but they are indeed different in the form in which they're executed and the form in which they're developed. So these areas have been mapped, and the entire job performance model, the capability model, has been mapped to a number of different frameworks. Of course, the NICE framework, that was one of the first and foremost mappings that was done, so that these assessments can be reported to provide a profile of somebody against a particular NICE framework profile. But they can also be done in other profile formats. For instance, the NSA knowledge units have been mapped to the framework of this capability maturity assessment, which allows educators, for instance, to identify how well their students are progressing against the knowledge requirements established by NSA for the cybersecurity field. Similarly, it's been done for industry frameworks. And just one as the example I mentioned is the ESC2M2. So understanding, are they ready to perform in utilities and other electric or energy sector environments in terms of securing, defending those critical infrastructures. And those are just some of a number of the different frameworks and competency models that have been mapped. And because it is such level of detail, underneath these 14 responsibility areas are literally thousands of tasks that needed to be measured or measurable in order to understand someone's potential capability with a measurement model that determines through a randomized sequence, how do we create an equivalent assessment without, of course, asking somebody to respond to thousands of tasks. And that really was the key to the standardization of the instrument that today allows us to truly build benchmarks at, again, the individual, organizational, or industry level. Next slide. So the participants in the study that we're going to report today were roughly over 250 individuals that were involved. As you can see from the list here, that most of them came from the educational community. They were part of an initiative the National Cyberwatch Center runs called the Curriculum Standards Panels, which is designed to help develop the nation's resources to accelerate and broaden and deepen cybersecurity capability. And they're all subject matter experts. In fact, we couldn't get into, in the limited time we have today, all of the details that we've discovered through this process. But it's one of the things that really jump out is the fact that we have subject matter experts spread in a lot of different areas. And just because someone is in academia doesn't mean they didn't spend a lot of time in industry or aren't currently spending a lot of time in industry. But we do have groups that were very specific. What we chose to focus on here today as a comparative is the financial services. But other industries have been involved and continue to request interest in applying the cybersecurity maturity assessments to their organizations and their industries. So energy, as I mentioned, technology, professional services, healthcare, defense contracting, especially those seeking CMMC guidance, and others are currently working with the maturity assessment or plan to in the near future. So it's really an ongoing program that we've designed that allow us to create some baseline, and that's really what we're going to report mostly on today, but then to look at how this changes over time. And one of the groups we've been working, especially in that area of how are we going to change the national profile of capability, is the National Cybersecurity Student Association, which today has close to about 2,000 members. And those members are invited to participate in monthly assessments that not only include the CCMA, but also include readiness to engage in their next course, or their understanding of certain concepts, concept inventories, or a new idea that we've just started, which is judgment inventories. Are they ready to make those types of decisions that will ensure the safety and security of systems moving forward? So in the end, the ultimate goal of a cybersecurity capability maturity assessment, which we'll talk about the results of here in just a second, are to create profiles, individual capability profiles or ICPs, and most important, individual development plans, because no capability stands still. It needs to be continually adjusted and enhanced and improved. And so because these are formative in nature, they enable us to get a picture for what would be the best thing for that individual to do, or that team to do, or that organization to do in order to most raise their capability maturity in the future. Okay, next slide.
So here we have another poll. Again, very quick, 30 seconds. What's your gut reaction? Which population in our study has the highest overall capability rates?
And while we're waiting, I see we had another question in the chat about what was the average median age of the higher ed students. You know, honestly, I don't remember. It's not something I don't think we reported on here. It was definitely not your traditional student, however. A number of these were community college students, as I'm sure everyone knows that the average age there tends to be a little higher than we see in, you know, especially some of the larger, you know, traditional higher ed institutions or universities. But I don't know the exact answer to that. I can try to look it up as we're progressing here. Well, Lauren's telling you a little bit more about the interesting findings we had. So so hold tight on that question and see if I can find an answer for you.
So let's take a look at our poll answers. Survey says, okay, stronger preference for financial services and evenly split then with the students and educators. All right, as David said, we're going to kind of move on a little bit more to results, but I want to set things up. So next slide, please. So CyberSeek, you may have heard earlier in the opening session that CyberSeek has updated their information, but for some time now, they've had this concept of the feeder role and the core cybersecurity roles. And we're, as I said, our survey was open to people who were in any of the work roles that are in CyberSeek. These don't specifically align exactly to the NICE workforce framework, but the feeder role are people who are coming into cybersecurity from other areas. And the 5 that you see here, networking, software development, systems engineering, financial risk analysis, security intelligence, these are people who may have some dealing with cybersecurity before they fully enter into cybersecurity, but they're common feeder roles. And then there are the entry level, mid-level, and advanced level core cybersecurity work roles in CyberSeek. And keeping these in mind as we move on to the next slide, when we started, David and I compared notes about initial assumptions. Having been in cybersecurity, having been a practitioner for 20 years, having been in research now for a while, one comes with a certain set of assumptions or life experiences that influence how you look at things. And the initial assumption was that years of experience and capability are not highly correlated. That means that there's not this, you've been doing something for 20 years, therefore you are definitely more capable than somebody who's only been doing things for 2 years. Another assumption is that certifications are not good predictors of skills. Certifications, often people say, if you can pass the test, you can get the cert. Doesn't matter if you can actually do the job. Another assumption was that certifications and employment are related. If you have the cert, you can do the job. Or that if you have done the job, you can get the cert. It works both ways. So those were some of the initial assumptions we had when we started looking at the data. And the question was, would the data bear those assumptions out? Next slide. So we come to our final poll here, and this is a 2-part. So thinking about what we've said so far, and go ahead and put up the poll. We're going to give you, yes, I get only 30 seconds. What feeder job roles are most associated with higher capabilities for cybersecurity? And what core roles in CyberSeek are most associated with higher cybersecurity capabilities? Go ahead, pick your feeder role, pick your core role. We'll give you a few moments here, and then we'll take a quick peek at the results in 3, 2, 1. Let's take a look at the results. Networking is in the lead for the feeder roles, followed by systems engineering, then software development, and on down. And if you will scroll, you will see that penetration and vulnerability tester led as the core cybersecurity core role, followed by cybersecurity specialist, incident analyst / responder, and the 2 entry-level jobs kind of on the bottom there. Okay, so you've all had an opportunity to think about this. Let's go ahead and close that poll and move on to the next slide. So this is where we're going to start talking about some observations of what we saw in the data. This is where it all comes together, folks. So one of those responsibility areas was analyze security incidents. So we took the data from 170 participants. We did not include the students who may or may not have actually been doing the tasks. And we said, all right, what is the benchmark of that responsibility area? On the left-hand side, you will see those benchmarks of novice, beginner, proficient, competent, and master. You see the percentile markings of anyone who's 0.49 percentile or below is a novice. Anyone who's 0.95 and above is a master, and the breakdown in between. And then you see the number of survey respondents who hit within that particular benchmark. So there were 37 novices, 91 qualified as beginners, 38 were assessed as proficient, 4 were assessed as competent based on the percentile scores, and there were no masters in 170 participants. On the right-hand side of the screen, you see a chart. The blue line represents an ideal, my ideal actually, because there isn't any accepted industry practice ideal of where things would fall, but you would hope that there would be a small number of novices followed by a chunk of beginners, but that the vast majority of your population is going to be proficient and or competent. And then masters are, of course, a little hard to come by, but hopefully more than there are novices. The orange line, by contrast, is what we saw in the data, with the peak being at the beginners and the number of masters falling well below the number of novices, proficient, and competent benchmarks achieved. This is I won't say it's an inverse curve, it's a flipped curve. Almost, I won't say the initial numbers, even as someone who spent time in business and started back in the day when you couldn't go to school for any of this stuff. You learned by practicing on your live production networks. It still is a challenging set of numbers to look at, but the reality is we are a new field, a new domain. You haven't been able to go to school for this. The knowledge, the skills, the tools, the technology, it's all been evolving so quickly that it is hard to keep pace and actually achieve mastery. So it's not surprising when you step back and look at it that the numbers in our study represent the high sharp curve and the slow finish out to masters. David, would you like to make a comment?
Yeah, let me bring a couple key points. Again, just to remind everybody that when we say master, we're talking about somebody equivalent to a member of the NSA security team. So we are really talking among the best of the best. Secondly, the percentiles that Laurin mentioned were originally developed by Benjamin Bloom, who you may be familiar with for the taxonomy of learning objectives. And he later, after the taxonomy, focused his efforts on really understanding mastery and understanding why most people don't get there, and what we could do in education in order to fix that. And in his investigations, he identified these ranges that an individual reaching that level of understanding would be roughly around the 75th percentile based on the studies that they had done, he and his doctoral students. And similarly, competent would get to around the 85th percentile, and master would be those top 5% of people in the country. Well, not surprisingly, you'd expect those numbers to be down below. But notice in Laurin's chart here how the biggest gap is not, there's a gap in proficiency, but the real gap is in competency. And what I think it speaks to is the difference between understanding and how that's developed, which is through instruction, and competency, which is developed through practice. And we have, lots of competitions and things that happen in the colleges, but where is the practice range for the everyday IT worker? In aviation, every month, the aviation teams, the crew, have to participate in simulation exercises, not only to understand the latest findings from the black box that they've learned from varying accidents or near misses, but they also have to practice what's new about the equipment and how that needs to be done. And they have to keep their skills current, because there aren't that many Sullenbergers that have landed on the river. But we need to make sure every pilot has that capability, because you never know when you're going to need it. And even Sullenberger didn't do it for the first time in that plane. There was plenty of opportunity to practice that in a simulation. And we lack those capabilities today, perhaps because we have not yet brought the practice field to the game.
So we're going to go on to the next slide. We've got 2 slides of very, very deep content. So there were 14 responsibility areas, and we noted that there were some different patterns in some of the responsibility areas. As you might have guessed from the previous slide, few scored above the competent benchmark in most of those 14 areas. The area that had the greatest number of novice benchmarks was in the conduct penetration testing. And this was true even in industry group. We're going to return to that in just a moment. I want to make sure we go through these points. The lowest number of proficient benchmarks was in respond to intrusions as a responsibility area. And the greatest number of proficient benchmarks was in managing security operations. Now, it may or may not come as a surprise to you that management responsibility areas, those 4 areas, overall had higher scores. In particular, the managed projects and budgets responsibility area ranked very high, and the communicating results had the greatest number of masters. So the short takeaway is that of the survey respondents, the 172 people, they were better at management and communicating results than at the technical responsibility areas. I'm curious to find out if anyone out there has any immediate responses, thoughts on why this may be. We'd love to have a more interactive discussion. Personally, my response to the concept of conduct penetration testing being the greatest number of novice benchmarks, and when I say that it was true even in industry, I think there was less than a percentile difference between financial services and the rest of everybody else on that one. That is something that a lot of organizations still do not do. And if they do, they outsource because it is perceived to be a very specific skill set. So it is in many ways unsurprising that that is something that a large number of people lack expertise in, aren't familiar with, they don't do it with any regularity. And it may be even true in the financial services group because of their compliance and regulation and ongoing issues, much more than average industry, that they have perhaps more awareness of the challenges in doing it and are more candid and aware in their responses in our survey to things like conduct penetration testing. The lowest number of proficient benchmarks being respond to intrusions. Again, if you are being able to identify that you have intrusions, you're ahead of the curve right now. If you're actually responding in a timely manner, again, you're ahead of the curve. We've all heard the reports of how long it takes for a company to notice that there is an intrusion and then to do something about it. I personally am intrigued still by the management responsibility areas having higher scores, particularly the communicating results, given the business perspective on cybersecurity folks that we don't communicate well to the C-suite. We don't communicate well outwards or to teams that we work with, that we often use a lot of jargon. But if you're communicating results to your own team, and you probably do spend a lot of time doing that, you might perceive that you are very good at communication. So thoughts on any of this through the chat, through the Q&A, we'd be happy to see and discuss. So there was a comment that the folks who have been in cyber IT the longest are the managers, and those skills are transferable across tech skills. And the tech parts are really brand new, essentially, for employees. Well, what's interesting is that even those who were relatively new, who had fewer years of experience, still ranked very high comparatively in management than the other areas. So it was not a question of, I've been in IT the longest, therefore now I've moved up to management, and therefore I'm good at things. There's actually, this is setting us up for the next slide. So why don't we move on to the next slide? So interestingly enough, there is no correlation between degrees and cybersecurity capability. One of the caveats I will put on that statement is that we asked for the type of degree. We did not ask for the field of the degree, the domain. So in my case, I would have had degrees in music performance and ancient history, which has nothing to do with cybersecurity. And so future looking at what actually is the domain of the degree and cybersecurity capability could be interesting. One of the very interesting findings is that certifications have some correlation to increased capability when you look at the number of certifications. So the most common certifications were A+, Network+, Security+, CISSP, and Certified Ethical Hacker. Those 5 came up a lot across the board. What we found is that if you had 3 or more certifications of any kind, there was a strong correlation to increased capability. By the time you got to 5 certifications, it was a very noted correlation to increased capability. 1 or 2 might or might not, it varied. But once you hit 3 certifications or more, that became an indicator of increased capability. And the feeder roles that have stronger associations with cybersecurity capability include network services. So give yourselves a hand, you got that one right. And data administrators, database administrators, which is a very interesting spin. Back in the day, the DBAs that I knew, they had complete and total control of their device, the host and the application, and they did everything soup to nuts. Nobody was going to interfere with their database. So it might still explain some of the increased association with data administrators. In the core roles that have the strongest association with cybersecurity, there's computer network defense analysis and incident response. So again, it's not to say that other roles don't have an association, but the strongest association was with those 2 roles. And again, that could be because computer network defense and incident response often are talking to many different people and are aware of different things and may have come through many different paths and have done many different things. This is an area we'd like to take a look at more in the future. So when recruiting or developing entry-level cybersecurity talent, look for DBAs and folks with network services in their background. So we have some interesting questions. I do want to go to the next slide briefly and say that all of this has been very interesting. And as Lord Kelvin once noted, if you can't measure things, that you can't improve them. This is an initial baseline. We've learned a lot about what questions we might want to ask in more detail. And we believe that a national survey encompassing educators, practitioners, and students is really needed, as indicated, to really understand where are we now and what are indicators that we should be focusing on in education, in programs, in the workforce, in certifications, to raise the bar faster, more effectively. Let's put the next slide up. So next, so if you want to get in touch with us, this is where you can reach us. I think we should spend the next 5 minutes going through the chat. We've got some interesting questions. And I'm going to start from the bottom. Framework with other folks who are assessing their workforce development program. David, you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's why the framework, that's exactly why this was developed. So as I mentioned, there are a number of industries that are already engaged. Obviously, there's a tremendous amount of activity right now in the defense contracting area because of CMMC, although CMMC today does not include a human firewall component. It's kind of like the early versions of the software CMM, and frankly, the first version of ESC2M2. Luckily, we were able to influence that somewhat, and so ESC2M2 added a number of things that were related to the human element, human factors. But nevertheless, contractors are aware that in order to meet the requirements, the technical requirements of CMMC, they're going to need to have the capability requirement that goes along with it. So yeah, we're more than happy to talk to anyone who's interested in either looking holistically at their organization, looking for gaps. There's been some really fascinating results. One example in the energy sector, the application of the assessment revealed a succession problem, very substantial issue that a number of their best and brightest were about to retire in the next couple of years, and they really didn't have a good bench. And so it altered dramatically for the CISO, who was really the primary target for the results of the study. He was personally interested in what did his organization look like. It provided a very directive approach to intervening with specific programs that were designed to raise the capability, raise the bar again across the organization. So definitely very interested in looking at that, and welcome the opportunity to talk to anyone.
So David, I'd like you to take a look at the question, more statement. If you are evaluating yourself, you don't know what you don't know.
That's true. It's actually a scientific fact. It's called the Kruger-Dunning effect. And what's interesting about the Kruger-Dunning effect is that it's more pronounced the lower you are in the expertise curve. So a novice truly doesn't know what they don't know. But as you start to gain expertise, you actually do begin to know what you don't know. And what we find when you get to the expert and master levels, one of the key things that differentiate them is knowing what they don't know and knowing when to reach out for assistance, when to look for more information, when to be a little bit more reticent in taking action because they have an awareness of what they don't know. So actually expertise alters that statement. And therefore, and it's not just any type of expertise, it's primarily this issue that differentiates the proficient from the competent, which we saw in the earlier slide was one of the biggest gaps we have today in at least the areas of the workforce that we investigated.
Right. So there was also a comment that industry partners indicate to us that they're looking for soft skills, such as the ones that we mentioned, and that the technical stuff is going to change regularly, but the industry needs graduates who can communicate effectively. And I just want to say in the plenary session, there was the discussion that the soft skills are kind of the power skills. And I know for me personally, I'd rather have hired someone who could talk and communicate and had those power skills and teach them the technology, teach them our tools and practices, and also someone who had, if you will, that inquiring, can do, don't shy away from a problem point of view and attitude, because you can't teach that part. It's really hard to teach that part. You can teach soft skills, you can improve soft skills, you can improve technology, but that drive to learn, to know the answer, to understand how things work, that comes from within. And I have never seen anyone be successful in teaching that.
Yeah, let me have one other note, maybe a closing note, because I know we're getting to the end. And that is, remember, the NBIC findings showed that overall performance was predicted more by the technical skill than the soft skills. Not that soft skills were important, they were almost equal, but that by knowing that, yes, tech skills change, we sometimes spend less effort on making sure they exist. And so we'd encourage more people, and the data suggests the DBA, the network services, that IT worker that today might be leaving the doors and windows open, making it easy for the burglars to come in. And when we're struggling to find the firemen, the SWAT team to prevent it, well, why don't we just make sure they stop leaving the doors and windows open by raising the technical capability of the entire IT workforce and not just focus on the cybersecurity specialists?
Right. I'm trying to get in the link for the NICE framework special issue, talking about how the NICE framework can be adapted, adopted, extended, has been published today. You can get that at csj.nationalcyberwatch.org, and it links at the top of the session or right here in the Q&A. And I thank you all for attending, and I hope it has been a good use of your time and ours.